Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. So, overloaded systems, ambiguous roles, poor visibility of work, broken flows, unclear decision rights. All of these explain poor performance far more than motivation, capability, or effort. But why do we point the finger at people when the real problems sit in the way the work is designed? We're absolutely honoured to be joined by Professor Nelson Repenning today. He has dedicated a huge amount of research to understanding how work really happens inside organisations and not how leaders imagine it happens as well. Professor Nelson is a School of Management Distinguished Professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management, and he's also Director of MIT's Leadership Centre. His work has been recognised externally extensively as well, being recognised as one of the world's top executive MBA instructors, and his scholarly work has appeared in top management journals and publications. In fact, some of his research has included things like why do so many management tools fail in practice, which is a fascinating area. He's a co-author, along with Donald Kiefer, of There's Got to Be a Better Way, which is possibly the best titled book we've read this year. How to deliver results and get rid of the stuff that gets in the way of real work, published this year. And Danny and I have been talking about this book for the last 6 weeks. Is it, Danny?
We have, yes.
Constantly. Yeah. It's a brilliant audio book, and the link to the both versions will be in the show notes today. But most of all, we want to say a huge thank you to Nelson for joining us. We're absolutely honoured to have it, and we're really looking forward with the great conversation with you today.
Kick us off, just tell us a bit more about the book. What was the inspiration behind it?
Yeah, I think it's easiest to proceed chronologically. I always tell people I've been at MIT my whole adult life, and I've really only worked on one problem, which you alluded to in the intro, which is basically why don't organizations use the tools and processes that we all agree are good things to do? And I would characterize the probably first 10 or 15 years of that research, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, as gloating over the stupid things that organizations do, because we could go into more on this in a moment, but, I had just endless examples of where the right tool or process was right in front of the organization and they couldn't seem to use it on a regular basis and were at the very least leaving money on the table. In some cases, led to really tragic outcomes. But at some point I found myself writing that same gloating paper over and over again. And I thought that I should rather, work on the solution rather than just document the problem in more excruciating detail. And that's sort of where my collaboration with Don, my co-author, really sort of, started to pick up some speed. And I think the way I would sort of phrase where the book came from is one of the experiences I've had in my professional life is I often have many of the puzzle pieces before I can see the picture that they snap together. And so Don and I started working together, we started teaching together, and we had a lot of little puzzle pieces that could really help people solve problems that they were facing in their organizations and were generating good results. And Don's a practitioner, so he had really a lifetime of track record of making organizations work better. And I think 10 years ago, we just said, we should really write this stuff down. And I have actually chapters on my hard drive from 2013 or 2014, and they're terrible. I mean, they're unreadable and they wander all around. And so we decided 10 years ago, we weren't quite ready, and we wrote a few papers. And then I think, probably 5 or 6 years ago, we thought, okay, I think now like the puzzle is clear enough that we can put it together. And then the real origin of the book, in all candor, is in January of 2021, I got COVID. And at least the MIT rules at the time were you couldn't be on campus for 10 days. So I was stuck at home with nothing to do. And I thought, if I don't start this now, it's never gonna get going. And I think that really the goal was to take all the things that we had done and the tips and tricks that we had learned about how to make organizations work better and put them into a cohesive, hopefully easily accessible format. And so that really was the goal of the book. And you'll have to tell me whether it delivers on that. So
it definitely does. And the kind of concept of the book is all about dynamic work design. So for people who haven't read your book or don't know what that means, can you define that for us?
Yeah, I think this was the last piece of the puzzle to really snap together. It's kind of funny. So I'm in the system dynamics group here at MIT. So thinking about organizational dynamics has been, my life. And I think the big insight that pulled all the pieces and all the tools together, and this came relatively late in the game, was if you think about most of the tools that we have to guide large organizations, so strategy and budgeting and capital planning and roadmaps and all those different elements, they're all implicitly based on the idea that we can forecast the future with some degree of accuracy, right? Every budget and every strategy, has an implicit presumption that we know what the world's going to be like 12 or 24 months from now or 5 years, whatever it might be. And we all know that's not true, right? Every article and every business publication starts with the sentence, the world's changing faster than it ever has before. And I don't know if that's true. I'm guessing in 1900, it felt like the world was changing pretty fast. But nonetheless, the world is a very dynamic place. And the tools that most organizations use are just not consistent with that. And so the problem, and this goes back to my earliest work on why people don't use the tools, is, imagine you make a strategy or a budget and the world changes midway through the year. Now what do? Well, what most people do is they don't change the strategy or the budget because they're supposed to be accountable to, those plans. And so what they do is they work around it. I always joke they bring out their duct tape and safety pins and chewing gum and try to kind of cobble together a set of interventions that will help them deliver their targets, even though the assumptions in that original plan are no longer relevant. And that's really where the trouble starts, because most of those changes tend to be under the waterline, they're surreptitious, and they tend to emphasize the short run rather than the long run. And that can descend organizations into this really nasty firefighting cycle that we talk pretty extensively about the book. And so the core idea of the tools in the book, and I think this is the piece that pulled everything together, was if we accept the fact that we can't predict the future perfectly, we might design some of our core processes differently. And I think the experience we've had is that when you take that perspective, it can unlock some surprisingly large gains in terms of how organizations work. And I don't think strategy and budgets and all that things are going away. But if you could temper that a little bit with this more dynamic perspective, again, I think our experience has been there's really some big wins you can have in terms of organizational performance.
And you talk about 5 kind of principles of dynamic work design.
So the first one is solve the right problem. And I think if I were to go back and redo that chapter, I would change the title to solve the right problem and then in parentheses and solve the problem right, so never get anything quite perfect. But the basic idea there is if we take this idea that the world's a dynamic place seriously, we're going to be constantly mismatched between what we're doing and what the world requires, right? That's sort of the definition of being a dynamic environment. And so the ability to recognize and close those mismatches quickly and to learn something in the process really is the first core skill that we think defines the more dynamic organization. And fortunately, most organizations already have training in that. Most large organizations have done some training around structured problem solving, whether it's the Six Sigma method or the Lean method. We're largely agnostic about that. But the first principle is really, if you take dynamics seriously, you need to raise your game about your ability to spot problems and solve them effectively. And the first principle is about that effective problem solving. Second principle is what we call structure for discovery. And that really speaks to how do we see when there's a mismatch? And, one of the big insights there is if you get down and look at the work, I'm sure we'll come back to this idea a couple different times, most jobs have been designed in ways that people doing those jobs often learn exactly the wrong lessons as to how to do their job effectively. And so the second principle is all about how do we design the work so the person doing it learns the right lessons about how to get better, and you can spot places where your organization is mismatched with what the environment requires. Third principle is what we call connect the human chain. And the basic idea there is once we've spotted a problem, let's make sure it gets to the person who's best positioned to solving it. I was just looking at the LinkedIn today, and Adam Grant, who many of your listeners probably know, had just posted this little thing that said this cultural norm that many organizations have of don't bring me problems, bring me solutions, might be my vote for the most damaging idea that you could have in an organization. I could go on about that for hours. But the idea behind the connect the human chain is don't think that way. The moment we spot a problem, let's make sure the organization is wired together so it gets quickly to the person best positioned to solve it. Number 4 is called regulate for flow. Basic idea there is most organizations have way too much work in them. In studies of R&D, it's not unusual to have 3 to 4 times as many projects as you have resources to do, which would seem disconnected to dynamism, except that when you take on too much work, your organization resembles a highway on Friday afternoon in the summertime, right? It's completely gridlocked with cars, and gridlock is not a dynamic, flexible system, right? We can't do anything. And so being able to regulate the amount of work you have in the system so that you match supply and demand actually turns out to be really key in terms of maintaining that ability and adaptability. And then the last one is what we call visualize the work. And the big insight there is, this is one of the things that, again, came out a little bit late in our research, is in retrospect, if you look at most of the major work design innovations out there, most of them have come in physical work and in particularly in factories. So think about Lean and Six Sigma and all those things. And I think the reason for that is that physical work is easier to design because it tends to give you clear signals when something's gone wrong, right? If I have Don used to run the engine plant at Harley Davidson, moving assembly line, you can see the engines chunked down. When the assembly line breaks, the work stops, right? And if you're the plant manager, you're probably going to walk over to the point where it stopped and, hey, what's going on? Can I help? Knowledge work gives us none of those signals, right? So while people are listening to this podcast, probably someone that works for you is getting stuck at this very moment. But when are you going to find out about it? Well, maybe they'll text you, maybe they'll send you an email, but you're fighting the psychology here a little bit in the sense that no one really wants to tell their boss, remember, bring me solutions, not problems. And so every knowledge worker will resonate with the idea that often really important pieces of information about problems only show up very, very late. And so the visualize the work idea is if we can create a kind of radar screen so that you can see the work move through your organization, that tends to surface problems much sooner. It makes the system much easier to manage. And to give you a little metaphor, imagine if air traffic controllers had to do their work using Excel spreadsheets. I think we would all be enormously hesitant to fly in that context. But, thank God they don't do that, right? They have a radar screen. They can see the planes move around and they can make smart choices. And so that last principle is really about what's the radar screen you use to see how the work is moving or not in your organization.
There's so many things we'd love to get stuck into in that. And I think that's been one of the big sources of conversation that we've had. But I think one of the things that really stood out for me is that they're called principles. They're not steps. They're not like steps 1, 2, 3 through to 5. What is it about those principles and how do you apply them in an organization?
So such a great question. And I'm really glad you picked up on that. The choice of the word principle is very deliberate. And the reason for that is, if you think about it, you all know this better than me, is so much of the management world, thought leader management world is about best practices, right? So we go see what Google does or Tesla, or I don't know who, NVIDIA might be the hot organization we're all looking at now. I don't know. And then whatever they're doing, if they're a high performance organization, we should do that too. But if you look at the research, that strategy really doesn't work that often. And I think for ex post, a fairly obvious reason, which is even if you are in the same industry and across the street from each other, every organization is a little bit different, right? They have different norms, they have different languages and so on. And so it's very difficult to take a practice from one place and just plop it down in the other and have it be successful. And I've done a lot of work in the energy industry, and at least in the US, a lot of the energy industry is literally on one freeway in Houston, Texas. And I've seen cases where you take a practice literally across the street, like from one company to the next, and the receiving company struggles because they do things a little bit differently than their otherwise very similar competitor on the other side of the road. And so the practical upshot of that is that anytime a manager or a leader tries to do something new, they're going to have to adapt that practice to the sort of local culture in their organization. The reason we chose the word principles is if you know a little bit why that practice works, right? What's the sort of behavioral principle about how it is that humans engage with work, then hopefully you're going to be in a better position to adapt that tool or that practice to the work. And so what I want from the book, and the reason we call them principles, is people to understand why these things work. I mean, you don't need to understand all the science and the Greek letters and the statistics behind it, but I want intuitively to know why this is a good thing to do when humans engage with work, so that as you're adapting it to your local culture, you can make smart choices about that adaptation. And just to give you a very simple example, in the early days of Harley Davidson long ago, when they were adopting some of the lean production tools, one of the things they did is they took all the Japanese words and they replaced them with plain spoken American words. That was a good choice for them, given that their major competitors were in Japan and their unionized workforce, wasn't so enthusiastic about adopting practices that came from another part of the world. In many cases, the adaptation's a little bit more sophisticated than that. But I think it's a really important role for managers trying to do new things that I think in many cases is a little bit undervalued.
I guess just you kind of sort of like making sure you're solving the right problem. Like, what are some of the symptoms that might indicate that you need this kind of work? I guess one of the terms that really stood out from us from the book was firefighting arsonists. Which is possibly the most colourful metaphor that we've seen in quite a while. So what might be some of the symptoms say, this is where we need to look?
So great question. I should say I was not the originator of the firefighting arsonist label. That came from, now a forgotten person at Harley Davidson. But the basic idea is of the firefighting, and I think the symptoms is, and we try to capture this in a quote from one of our former students. It's right in the first page of the book. And the quote is the person said, I know my organization's in trouble when I show up on Monday morning, I sit in my office, I make a list of all the important things I want to do that week. I work my ass off all week. And then Friday afternoon, I go back to my office, I check my list, and I've got nothing done. And, the way I sometimes try to sort of summarize that is that in that situation, the system is managing you rather than you are managing it, right? And if you have that feeling, right, that you don't control your day and you're constantly responding to what's happening in your organization rather than making choices about strategy and capabilities and so on and so forth, then I think this tool set is probably for you, because it's what the source of that firefighting is, and we alluded to this a little bit earlier, is that you have an organization that just is not able to adapt to the changes in the world, at least using its formal processes. And so that's when the workarounds and the surreptitious stuff come in. And the kind of cruel irony or paradox of all of this is that those workarounds are done with the best of intentions, but they tend to make the organization in the long run more rigid rather than more flexible, because what you get is this kind of amalgam of all these little pieces of chewing gum sort of mushed together that doesn't add up to the results that anybody wants. So if you feel like you're out of control, if you feel like you have too many meetings, if you feel like you're just reacting to things that happen during the day, that you go to boring meetings all day, and then the most important stuff happens in your email inbox at night, or, on Slack messages on your phone or whatever, then I think this is probably a useful exercise. Just to give a little color to the firefighting arsonist, where that came from is Harley had these problems extremely acutely and really struggled to get projects out the door. And every year, the month or two before product launch was just this nonstop chaos of people flying from the R&D center to the factory and carrying parts in duffel bags. It was just a huge mess. But it turned out that there were some project managers that were much better at that than others. And so that raised this really interesting question that my students at the time sort of dug into, which is, why is it that a few people are so good at running this gauntlet of all this chaos compared to, their colleagues? And at the time, those project managers were known as the firefighters. And that was a compliment at the time. Like, if your project's important, make sure it's managed by one of these people. And so we did a little kind of informal research about what made them good firefighters. And in retrospect, the answer was pretty clear, although I'm not sure we knew it ahead of time, which was the firefighters had better social network to the scarce resources required to get their project done, right? And Harley's a relationship-based company. At least at the time, the employees spent a lot of time socializing outside of work. And so, I might go to you, Garen, and say, you might be in charge of the test lab, but, my project's not number one on the list, but I just need this test. Couldn't you just run, move me to the top and get it done, get my data, and hey, I'll see you this weekend at the bowling league or a motorcycle ride or whatever. And so what the firefighters would do is they would go around to all the scarce resources and basically use their social network to pull resources towards their projects. And so, what was happening, of course, and the reason for the firefighting arsonist terminology is, yes, they were getting their projects done, but they were leaving this wake of chaos behind them because, the less charismatic project manager was not getting his test results as quickly and had to wait longer. And it just, the mess kind of reinforced itself. And we see versions of this in almost every organization we visit that, the place is a mess, but smart, talented people figure out how to get their work done. Problem is that the methods that they sometimes choose don't add up to the results that the organization necessarily wants.
As you were talking, I was just thinking, how do we convince people? So when people are stuck in that firefighting mode and they're just constantly reacting, how do you convince them that there is a way out of it? And it's not just, this is just the way things are, there's no way out.
Because it's addictive.
Because it is addictive, yeah.
Yeah, it's another fabulous question. And I remember once at Harley sitting in a meeting with the then chief executive officer, who was a very smart guy. He had been an engineering professor at a major university. I mean, really very intelligent. And he looked Don and I right in the face and just said, product development's messy. Nothing you can do about it. Exactly what you said, Danny, that's just the way it is. And, there's no point in trying to manage it. And, this was probably in the mid 1990s. And, the fact that there was a company called Honda that was, developing products in half the time for half the money, like somehow just didn't register with him. And I don't think, it's any lack of intelligence on his part. Quite the opposite. I just think he was so in the fishbowl of how they were doing stuff. It was very difficult to conceive an alternate reality, even though there were compelling examples in other industries. So I think it is easy to learn the wrong lesson in these settings. If you spend enough time in it, you start to just believe that's how the world works. And so in terms of how you get people sort of over the hump to change it, here's the thing not to do. Don't walk in and say, I heard this podcast from this guy at MIT, or I read this book and they tell us we're doing everything wrong and we need to change everything at once. I promise you that won't work. The strategy that we've had the best luck with is to really proceed incrementally, which is to find the biggest piece of chaos, formulate a clear problem statement. That's the principle one from our format. Scope it down to an even smaller manifestation of it if you can, and just solve one little problem. Get a couple points on the board, make this work a little bit better, Because once people can see like, oh, like there actually is a better way, sorry to connect to the title of the book, then the momentum really starts to pick up. And so to give you an example, there's a case we talk about in the book. I had a former student that works at a big semiconductor manufacturer around here, and they were trying to reduce the product development time, which I think was 3 or 4 years in total. But for his project, he scoped it down to just one piece, which is what they call first silicon characterization, which is basically when you have the first prototype chip, it's actually a fairly complicated process to measure the performance of, because there's power and speed and heat, and there's a whole bunch of different things. And that was a 4-month chunk of that overall 4 years. And so his initial project basically took that 4 months down to 1 month. Once he did that, everybody's like, oh, wait, we can make a difference. Now we can move on to other pieces or other parts of the organization. But I think that kind of creeping incrementalism tends to work much, much better. And I will say, particularly for the more senior leaders that are listening to the podcast, it will feel in the beginning like you're working below your pay grade, right? I think big leaders often think that I'm a big leader, I got a big span of control, I need to make big changes to solve our problems. And I think, and the way that results, and I use this little cartoon all the time, is, okay, we're going to have a big initiative. We're going to have t-shirts and coffee mugs and offsites, and we're going to hire consultants, and we're all going to sign our name to the wall. You all know these trappings as well as I do, but that just doesn't work very often, and for a lot of reasons. And so it will feel like you're working below your pay grade, but if you can kind of get over that, I think you'll learn a lot about how your organization actually works. And once you have succeeded in a small area, it becomes much easier to propagate it to the rest of the organization.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I guess you mentioned it earlier, like the ability to expedite things. You can all see because some people's careers are actually based on the ability to expedite the system. And it's kind of where organizations lose their way a little, isn't it? Where it's like the needs of the individual, it serves your career. Like expediting's good. How do you start to sort of take that on as a challenge? And I guess that starting small means you've got an evidence base to point at to say it can improve things.
Yeah. And I think so that just for a little background, in the pre-lean world of manufacturing, expediting was actually a job class in factories. So there was a group of people, they were often your sort of most experienced hands, who would show up in the morning, they'd find all the things that you were supposed to make that were going to be late, and then they would hand carry them through the factory, right? It was exactly like the firefighters did in product development at Harley. And they would basically move them to the top of the queue in every sort of station throughout the factory and get them done. And I think the thing that people didn't understand at the time is that is sadly a very self-fulfilling prophecy, which is that if I expedite one project or job or whatever, I've made every one of the others late. And then tomorrow, those need to be expedited. And pretty soon, the only way anything gets done is through expediting, right? Nothing ever gets done through the normal process. And in the world of knowledge work, we are all professional expediters, myself included, and one of the examples I use in class is, how many times have you sent someone an email and then picked up your phone and texted them, hey, just wanted to let you know I sent an email, right? That is the knowledge work version of expediting, right? And then if they don't respond to your text, how many times have you then picked up the phone and said, hey, I don't know if you saw my email, right? All of this is basically, we're treating jobs or work or whatever it is as a special case. And it just gets worse. And pretty soon, the only way things get done is with this kind of all hands sort of expediting. I think once people see that, they tend to have a pretty intuitive understanding of how inefficient it is. But that's not the same thing as having the experience of doing it right. But the other sort of little rhetorical gambit that I think we sometimes use to kind of get this idea seared in people's heads is, I think everyone's had the experience of when you've had a crisis, and suddenly all the organizational BS and competing priorities sort of melt away. And then people are like, oh, wow, you're right. During that crisis, wow, we got a lot done, and it was more fun, and it was more satisfying. And I think if you can kind of tap into that experience, I often say, like, wouldn't it be nice if we could get that level of joy and functionality in our work without having to really screw something up first? People are like, well, yeah, that would be great. And so I think if people can kind of get that in their head, then the next step is to, let's find a small experiment where we're just going to work on a few things till they're done and then move on to the next ones and not expedite. And then once they experience it, then I think you're off to the races in terms of making things work better.
Which is interesting because even the most dysfunctional organization is able to do that in a crisis, isn't it? So it does show that there is that latent capability in an organization should it require.
Yeah, I mean, I think, at MIT during the summer of 2020, when we were, in lockdown from COVID, we had one goal, which was get the students back on campus in September safely. I think we got more done in those 3 or 4 months than maybe in the previous 5 years. Right? We built testing stations and card swipe terminals and a custom app and a ton of infrastructure. We had a super clear target. There were no competing priorities. A lot of the hierarchy and stuff, kind of disappeared because we were all aligned with that target. And again, wouldn't it be nice? And I think this is one way to understand dynamic work design is if we could work that way, at least similar to it all the time, rather than have to wait for a global pandemic or some other major calamity. So,
and one of the things you talk about in the book, which I thought was really interesting, was the importance of observing the work. And we don't spend enough time, do we, kind of really just watching what's going on rather than trying to fix.
Yeah, so this is a principle that we appropriated from Toyota. The Toyota production system has always been very big on what they call go to Gemba, and the word Gemba is that sort of loosely translates in Japanese to the place where the work gets done. And in our sort of problem solving process, step one is formulate the problem statement, and step two is go see the work happen. And I think the easiest way to kind of give you a sense of how this really feels is I teach a project class here to our executive MBA students. And so assignment one is pick a problem you're going to solve in your home organization. And then assignment two is go see the work. And as they're walking out of class, when I give them this assignment, we always give them the guidance of when you go do your go see and assess, if you're not embarrassed by what you find, you're just not looking closely enough. And the students look at me like, oh, this guy at MIT is in the ivory tower. He doesn't understand my organization. We're really good at what we do. I'm not going to find anything embarrassing. I'm like, yeah, okay, just try it. I make the rules. You have to do it. And then when they come back a couple weeks later for the next class, I always open class with, hey, anybody find anything embarrassing? And then we spent 45 minutes sharing stories about the crazy stuff that people find. I think what's so interesting about that is that the crazy stuff that people find is not because you have bad people working for you. It's exactly the opposite, right? Because of these static assumptions and the fact that we can't adapt processes to the changing world, that pushes people into these workarounds. And so all these nutty things that people find when they go see the work are all the result of really well-intentioned efforts to get the work done in an impossible situation. Last year in the class, I had a student who was a kidney transplant surgeon. And so his problem was to try to turn around the operating room faster so they could get more surgeries done. He's going to see the work and he's watching the nurses get the room set for the next surgery. And they have these plastic bags that have the instruments in them that they, the scalpels and sort of various pieces. And the nurse is like ripping open a bag. She'd look at it and then she'd put it aside and she'd rip open another bag. And it turns out what's going on is she's looking at the instruments, and some of them had what they euphemistically called bioburden, which was basically leftover stuff from the last surgery that hadn't been properly cleaned off. And she just kept ripping bags open, in one case, 8 bags, until she found a clean set of instruments. Okay, what's going on here? Well, he does a little, follows the work, and it turns out the instruments after surgery go to the cleaning room, which has the autoclave. The people in the cleaning room have no idea why they're doing this. They're completely disconnected from the other activity. They don't know why it's important. The autoclave is old. They don't have performance standards. And so just in that little moment of looking at this piece, he discovers a whole supporting process that as a surgeon, he'd never even really known was there, that no one had ever thought about, and came up with some really easy wins to make that stuff work better. So I think if you're going to fix the work, because it's this amalgam of all these adaptations, you really need to go see it. And when you do that, you'll typically discover a bunch of really easy to exercise improvement opportunities that you can often fix right away. And, one of my favorite examples that we talk about a little bit in the book is it's always a surprise, at least to Don and me, that the number of times you find a balky printer that is delaying thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of work, which seems insane in this electronically connected day and age. But there's still a lot of printers out there. And in Don's own shop, when he worked at Intermatic, right, this dot matrix printer was delaying tens of thousands of dollars worth of work each day because they couldn't print out the pick sheets that people would then get to go pull the things that were going to be shipped that day off the rack. So those are the kinds of things that you find. And so, just to kind of wrap this up, make the time to go see the work and you will learn a lot about what happens in your organization. And that often can, really be the catalyst to a whole new trajectory for making your organization work better.
And just one follow-up question and it might seem like a dumb question. And you talk about it in the book is that one of the things about manufacturing is you can actually see the work moving around the factory, can't you? But like you're sort of saying, like with knowledge work, it can just go into someone's day book and it just doesn't move, does it? It just gets carried over. Like, how do you observe knowledge work? Like what's a good practice for that?
So I think, in some cases you can watch it. It can be as simple as watching your software engineers or seeing the meetings or, watching how often they sit at their desk. And some days, I think in many cases, you have to sit down and talk to people and, ask them, well, how do you do your work? And One of the other techniques that we talk a little bit about in the book is we often get students to draw process maps, but we recommend doing it a little bit differently than I think the conventional ones, which is we're not so worried about what an individual does for their work. We kind of assume that they know what they're doing, but just map how the work moves from person to person. And we draw these really silly little stick figures and then arrows from one person to the next. But often if I get people to just say like, okay, Garen, when do you start your work? Well, I get an email from Danny saying, hey, I read this book and I think it might be a good topic for the podcast. Okay, well, what happens next? You think about it a little bit and then maybe you email someone else or you email Danny back, and like just that nuts and bolts mapping of how those ideas move back and forth really will reveal a lot. And what you often find is the diagram has this kind of Jackson Pollock modern art flavor to it because the arrows are all over the place. And it's because no one's ever thought about it, right? It's knowledge work. And so it doesn't have a clear routing or path like it would in the factory. And in many cases, again, just drawing that little picture can lead to really simple.
Which I guess leads on to one of your principles, which is visualize the work, which for me, this whole book was chicken soup for the soul. It's just, this is where we are all of the time. And the fact that you just had such great research and insight, it was a real joy to read. And I think it was like the simplicity of it, but the way that it's done. So visualizing the work and get it up on the wall, and you can actually see the speed at which work goes, and it gets stuck as well. What led you to that sort of understanding of that way of working, and how can that be applied?
So Don really first learned about this technique with some contact from folks that had worked in some of the major Japanese manufacturers like Toyota. So the Japanese version of this is called Obeya, which stands for big room. And at the time when we first learned about it, it was a very manual process with whiteboards and Post-its and markers, and we'll come to the more modern version of that. But I think this is a case where they had learned this through experience. And so there was a lot of ritual that went to the technique, some of which was very helpful and some I think in retrospect wasn't helpful. Don experienced it in his factory and, saw immediately that, wow, there's a lot of power here. And so we started really experimenting with it and trying to figure out what was actually going on here and why did this work and why didn't it work and where could we adapt it? And I think, back to the little analogy I gave you earlier, right? What we've come to believe is that, and I don't think we appreciated this when we first saw it, is that first, physical work is easier because, again, it tends to give you clear signals about when it's going well and not going well. Knowledge work is much harder for all the reasons you just cited. And almost any visualization that you can create that shows the work move, and then when it's not moving, can help us sort of leverage all the visual system that we have as human beings to make better choices about how to allocate our scarce resources. And so to give you a little cartoon of how this works, often in R&D processes, which tend to be very Byzantine and a lot of back and forth, the first thing we'll do is we'll take a team and say, okay, just draw a little picture of your process on the whiteboard or the wall or whatever. We have an idea phase, we have an investigation phase, and then we coding or whatever it might be. Then step 2 is, all right, here's a book of Post-its. Just every project that you're working on right now, put it on a Post-it and put it in the right space on the board. Okay? First thing that happens is they immediately say, like, I had no idea how much work we had going on, right? So this gets to the regulate the flow thing. Often there'll be 2 or 3 times as much work as they have resources to do. And more interesting, at least for me, is it's very rare that any single person in the organization, even the nominal boss, knows about every project that's underway. So these kind of product development funnels tend to be very porous where people have an idea, they just start working on it. So that in and of itself is a really useful exercise. Like, okay, we need to set some priorities or learn to manage this better. But then once they kind of get that a little bit rationalized, what we then ask people to do is on each Post-it or digital card, write down the date that this project is supposed to exit this particular phase. Fine. And then if it misses the date, put a contrasting color Post-it, usually pink for us, on top of it. Okay. Now, when we see the board, you can see what's on schedule and what's late. Okay. Then when you meet in front of the board, like, okay, let's talk about the ones with the pink Post-its first, right? Because that's the place where the assembly line is broken. Maybe we have a problem to solve. Maybe we need some more resources. Maybe we have a competition or whatever it might, a competition with another activity, whatever it might be. And suddenly the team can really use its scarce resources much more effectively to focus on the exceptions rather than just, the tedious project reviews that we all have wasted years of our life in, oh, everything's fine, let's move on to the next one. That's not a useful time, right? We want to focus on the places where stuff is broken. And then the last little piece is, and we've seen this a couple different places, is you may rationalize the portfolio, but if you're not careful, new projects will creep in and you'll be back into that overload state. And so if every project is late, and in one of the groups we work with, because they use the pink Post-its, they talk about their board going pink, right? If every Post-it has a pink Post-it on top of it, that means you've now crept back into the overload situation. And now we need to have another discussion about getting the right amount of work. So we've had really good luck with this. People are a little bit suspicious of it at first, and they'll say, well, my work can't be managed, and so on and so forth. But if people make the effort to do it, it becomes a really powerful tool. And then, the one other thing I should probably say is now in the post-COVID world where work is so remote, you're probably going to need a digital tool rather than the Post-its and the whiteboards. Totally fine. There's a lot of good tools out there, and this is a space that's changing very rapidly. So I suspect the tools will get better fast, and they're already pretty good. But I think the corollary to that is the magic of the visual management at the end of the day is the quality of the conversation that you and your team have in front of the board, not the board itself. And I think the one risk of the digital tools is I might say like, hey, I'm really busy. I can't make the meeting today. I promise I'll check the board when I get home tonight. The moment that happens, I think the magic is lost because it's the human conversation in front of the board where you get to make smart choices as a team about what you work on that really matters. So I have no problem with digitization. I think it's a reality that everybody faces. And the digital boards do enable a lot of features that you don't get with the Post-its, but keep the cart and the horse in the right order, right? If you're having a good quality conversation about resource allocation in front of the board, it's probably working for you. If people are obsessed with the colors and the shapes and integrating it with other systems, but you're not having good meetings, then I think you kind of missed the mark a little bit and probably need to reset.
Hi, we're just pausing this interview for a moment. Have you ever finished an episode of the OrgDev podcast and wish you had a cheat sheet that summarizes all of the key points? Us too, so we made one. It's called From Pod to Practice, and each week in our newsletter we'll share a 2-page summary of the latest OrgDev episode, and it includes key takeaways, a reflection prompt, and one small action you can try.
And it's all in a digital format with space at the end to add your own notes and reflections, and it's designed to help you take the learning from the podcast into your day-to-day work. So to get your copy, just sign up to our Next Step to Better newsletter. The link's in the show notes, or you can visit our website at www.distinction.live to get the latest From Pod to Practice in your inbox. And let us know what you think. We'd love to get your feedback. And you talk in the book about huddles and handoffs, don't you? The huddle being the kind of conversation around that sort of board, but a handoff can be, if something's quite standardized, then you can have maybe a checklist or something more structured, and not to use them in the wrong way at the wrong time.
No, you got it exactly right. I think, and this is sort of embedded in the connect the human chain principle, which is if you think about work moving from person to person, particularly knowledge work, there's some work that because it's sufficiently well-defined that you and I don't necessarily need to have a conversation, right? Simple example, I get my paycheck every 2 weeks. It just shows up. Everything's been pre-negotiated. That's what we call a handoff, right? That transfer is really clearly defined. And, it would be a huge waste of time to have a meeting every week to just like, hey, Nelson, here's your paycheck. Do you have any questions? Well, no, it's exactly the same as it was 2 weeks ago. But on the flip side, there's many things in the world of knowledge work where, if I'm transferring the work to you, right, it can't be captured in a checklist because the work is really ambiguous and there's a lot of stuff that's going on. And so that's a place where we probably want to leverage the value of face-to-face communication to transfer that work. And so we call that a huddle. And the reason I think this distinction is useful is once you think about it this way, particularly in knowledge work, you can see lots of places where we're using huddles when it should be a handoff, and occasionally places where we're using handoffs that should be huddles. And so if you think the latter, where maybe I email the work to Garen when in fact we should probably have a meeting. If it's ambiguous work, right, we are setting ourselves up for trouble because he doesn't know exactly what I was thinking. We didn't transfer with the conversation. Mm-hmm. And so one of two things is going to happen, which is either I've introduced a defect because he's not clear on what I was going to do and I'm going to make an assumption, or what I think happens more often is he's going to email me back. Hey, what about this? What about that? And before you know it, we've emailed back and forth 12 times to kind of get this ambiguity sorted. It would be infinitely more efficient for you and I just to have a 5-minute conversation in that handoff, right? And, we all know that this is a problem intuitively because I think everyone's had a text message chain that has gone horribly off the rails because of some, unsurfaced assumption like, oh, you meant we were going to meet on the west side of town at the hamburger place or whatever. Those conversations are much more effective face-to-face. So thinking about these transfers, about which one of these can be handoffs, which are very efficient, and which ones really need to be huddles, again, can unlock some really big gains. And as a really practical guide, if you find any sort of transfer that requires zillions of emails and you have these long email chains or, big long Slack threads, almost certainly you're missing a huddle in there, right? And a 15-minute meeting can often take hundreds of emails a day out of your email system because you're using communication for what it's good for in those contexts.
And you talk about an evaluation of a good meeting is how many decisions were made and how many problems were solved. Is that a good metric, is it?
Yeah. So, I'm probably guilty of just devolving into the scholarly version, right? If you read the communications research and so on and so forth, what is face-to-face communication good for? It's for processing ambiguity, right? When we're transferring uncertain information, that probably sounds a little bit abstract. So I think the practical version of that is exactly as you cite, which is, what's a meeting good for? Well, we should either be making decisions, right, which usually involve some kind of ambiguity processing, or solving problems, which almost for sure has some kind of ambiguity embedded in it. And so if you're trying to assess whether we need this meeting, right, just keep track on a piece of paper, how many decisions we make or problems we solve. And I'm guessing for many people, they go to a lot of meetings where that number is pretty close to zero for each instance. That probably could have been a handoff rather than a huddle. And then I think another way to see this is just think about the cartoon of when your organization wants to do something new, right? You go to your 60 or 90-minute meeting, you watch a bunch of slides, there's one softball question at the end, right? It's been all one-way information transfer. And then you walk out in the hallway and you look at your colleague like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? I'm going to have to change this, I'm going to have to change that. And you're up all night on email trying to sort of sort out the ambiguity. That's almost exactly backwards as to what would be an efficient use of your time, right? That PowerPoint presentation probably could have been sent out as a pre-read, or you can do the Amazon thing and just have everyone sit and read the memo for the first 15 or 20 minutes, and then have a two-way conversation about what are we going to have to do differently as a consequence of this new direction for the organization, because that face-to-face meeting is an ideal venue to sort out all the little adjustments that we're going to need to make. Like, okay, Garen, I'm going to have to change the logo. Well, don't change the logo. Because there's a lot of back and forth as we're trying to coordinate all this different activity. And the moment that devolves to the electronically mediated communication, typically you're just wasting a lot of time and energy.
And the other thing, as I was reading this particular part of the book, I was thinking about AI and kind of organizations introducing AI agents into their workflows and what that might mean. And I haven't got any answers, but it made me think.
I think we're in the questions phase of AI.
Yeah, well, let's see. We're at 10:30, so we've gone almost a half hour without saying AI, so that's pretty good. I've been joking lately that as an MIT professor, I'm contractually obligated to say the words AI at least every 15 minutes. So I think I violated the terms of my employment a little bit. But I do think AI has so many opportunities for improved work design. And I also think most organizations in the short run are going to screw it up pretty badly. And there's an analogy that I've been using lately. It's kind of old, but I think it's illustrative, which is if you go way back in the Wayback Machine to the 1980s, there was a point in which I think the U.S. auto manufacturers were really starting to realize that their Japanese competitors were quite formidable and that they were losing market share, so on and so forth. And so at that time, GM in particular decided that the way they were going to compete was through robots. So Jack Smith, who was the CEO at the time, made this enormous push. We're going to build these lights out, fully robotic factories, and this is going to get us back in the game. And, I went back and looked at this, and the expense that they had at the time was somewhere between $50 and $100 billion on robots, right? And this is 1980, so this is like an enormous amount of money, and it never worked. The robotic factories never had the same productivity as their more human-centered factories. You go back and read some of the case studies, the robots were painting each other and they were welding car doors shut. I mean, it was a disaster. And a former CFO of GM calculated that for the money they spent on robots, GM could have bought Toyota, right? Imagine how different that industry would be today if GM had just acquired Toyota. So total disaster. Yet, fast forward today, 45 years, right? You go to any automobile factory or any factory really, right? There's automation robots everywhere, right? So they had the right answer, right? But the way they went about implementing it was clearly flawed. And if you contrast that with other manufacturers, they went in a much more incremental mindset, like, okay, here's a job that is unsafe and people are getting injured because you have to lift something heavy. Okay, let's use a robot there. That's a really good choice. And then we'll learn a little bit about how the robots interact with our work and we'll grow kind of incrementally. And I think that for me is a really cautionary tale about AI, which is, AI in some sense is going to be the robots for knowledge work. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's close enough. And I think what's happening right now is people are getting the cart and the horse in the wrong order again, which is, we need to have an AI. Every CEO is getting pressure from their board to have an AI strategy right now. And so I think there's a strong tendency to, we're just going to do AI everywhere. And I think that's going to be a big mistake, right? The AI agents are not going to get along with each other and so on and so forth. So I think the right strategy here is going to be exactly as we sort of, evangelize more generally, is the goal of processes is deliver value to the customers, right? None of them are perfect. So find a problem where you think AI is a good solution. Use it there. You're going to learn a little bit about how AI interacts with the organization and build it incrementally. And another way of saying this is I have a former student that has this fabulous phrase that I utter all the time in this context, which is he said, there's few ways to lose money faster than trying to automate a process you understand or don't understand. And I think that's exactly what's happening now. And so you're going to see this big backlash. And then once that kind of goes through it, then people will be a little bit more sensible, like, oh, this is a great application. This is a great application. And then, we will learn our way into it. And I'm sure if we have this conversation 20 years from now, AI will be ubiquitous, but there will also have been a lot of wasted money when people have, kind of gone about it. And I think in an overly enthusiastic way, maybe is the nicest way to say it.
One of the things that I really wanted to ask, because as I've been reading the book, I've been obsessing about different chapters. And I think one of the ones that I've been thinking about a lot is regulate for flow. And the way it kind of sort of challenges some of the natural assumptions, it's almost like counterintuitive. And you gave a particular example of an ICU intensive care unit. And the fact, the prevailing mindset was, surgeons are really expensive. We need to fully utilize them at all times. But what it didn't meet the capacity in the chain. So could you just tell us a bit more about that and how that sort of challenges people's mindsets?
This is probably the single most counterintuitive idea in the book, which is that, and I think the core of the regulate the flow is that many people have the mental model that the more stuff I cram in the beginning of the process, the more I get out the other side. And that is just not true. And it's not true for a variety of reasons that we could go into. But when you overload a process, it tends to get people to be focused more on short run interventions rather than long run. Turns out there's a pretty substantial overhead just associated with task switching, right? So if I have 6 projects I'm working on, I put one down, I have to move to the next. Okay, what are we working on? What, so on and so forth. Like that's just expensive. People are more efficient when they can work on 1 or 2 things and not be interrupted. And then also overloaded systems are just very fragile to small interruptions. This is why you get traffic jams on Friday afternoon, which is there's just more cars on the highway that it can handle. And each little hiccup just basically causes the thing to grind to a halt.
Also, because you give an example of like you wouldn't stop a pilot halfway through landing and say, would you mind just helping us with this other task?
Yeah, exactly.
But that happens in organizations, doesn't it?
Right. Or if you have a heart surgeon that's in the middle of, some invasive procedure, right? If another high, value patient shows up, you're not going to be like, okay, stop, we'll come back to this later. Like, that's risky and dangerous on a whole bunch of different levels. And so the basic idea behind regulate the flow is we need to figure out, right, what is the right amount of work to put in the system that maximizes the throughput. And it's interesting because lots of organizations think they do this, but there's sort of 2 ways to do this, which I call bottom up and top down. The bottom-up strategy for doing this, I think lots of organizations are pretty familiar with, which is, okay, I look at this project, I scope it out, and it has about 50,000 hours of work in this. And then I compare this to the organization, and okay, we have the resources to do this over 3 years or something like that. And there's usually really complicated spreadsheets or work planning management tools that go with that. That approach is notoriously unreliable because that 50,000 hour estimate is almost for sure too rosy. There's actually good scholarly evidence that when people make these plans, they almost always devolve to the best case scenario rather than the average scenario. And so what we preach, at least as a complement to that, is you really need to learn your way into the right loading and not count entirely on that sort of bottom-up approach. So I think of that as the top-down. And the way that we recommend doing that is very similar to what we were talking about with visual management, which is the basic rule should be the work needs to keep moving, right? And if the work starts to slow down and is stopped and is stuck on your desk or someone's desk, that almost for sure means that you have too much in the process. And so this is where the visual tools can be enormously helpful, because if a task is stuck in my inbox and it's not getting done, it means I'm overloaded. And we need to sort of reconfigure that. So to go back to the story, which is I was talking about this in class. And one of the things that we talk about in class is to get this point is we contrast pull versus push systems in manufacturing. So a push system is every time a new job just shows up, I push it into the factory, irrespective of whether it has capacity. And the result is there's just inventory everywhere and everyone's sort of working like crazy to get stuff done. The essence of a pull system is we fix the amount of work that we have in the system and we only let a new task in when another one is completed. So we have a way of controlling that volume. So I was talking about this in the context of manufacturing, and one of my students who was in class at Bill Manji, was a cardiac surgeon. And he said, I realized that unbeknownst to me, because I'm a doctor, not a manufacturing guy, we were running a push system in my hospital. And what that meant is that every morning doctors would come at 7:30 and they would start to do heart surgery cases. And then when you were done in the operating room, you would be pushed to the intensive care unit, which was the next step in the care chain. But when they started cases in the morning, they had no idea whether the ICU had capacity or not, right? And so what would happen is some days, they'd have complications in the ICU and there wouldn't be capacity. And so patients literally out of heart surgery would have to sit in the hallway trying to get care until a bed opened up in the ICU. And this is really the big insight, is it turns out that if you had to sit in the ICU, in the hallway before getting the ICU, you were more likely to have complications, because that was, the hallway is not sort of designed for your care, which meant you would stay in the ICU longer. So what Abil did, really clever project, is he said, well, let's make this a more pull style system. Every morning, we're going to count the number of beds that we think are going to be ready in the ICU. And that's how many cases we're going to do, so that we're allowing the ICU to gate the process. And of course, he gets a little pushback from his cardiac surgeons, because at least in the early days, it might mean that, I'm bringing my mother in for this, very nerve-wracking heart procedure. And the doc might say, I'm sorry, we can't do it today. You're going to have to come back, right? That's not something any doctor wants to say. But here's the sort of trick. And I think this really captures the counterintuitive part, which is, if you get people into the ICU faster, you get them out faster. And so once they put this system into place, the capacity actually went up because they had a smooth flow of work. And Abil actually wrote a really nice paper about this and analyzed the data pretty carefully, which he generously allowed me to attach my name to. Does not mean I'm a real doctor by any stretch of the imagination. But they were to show that the average length of stay in the ICU fell by about 0.7 of a day, right? So they were getting people out almost a day faster because they got them in right away. And so once you get that workflow going more smoothly, capacity goes up rather than down, and you get a system that is more flexible. And again, just to kind of finish where I started, this is a super and counterintuitive idea, I think, for many leaders, which is that by starting less work, I feel like I'm giving up on flexibility. But in fact, because the cycle time falls so much, you actually get a system that is both more productive and more adaptable. And, this is definitely a kind of, I have to see it to believe it situation. But in many of the applications we've seen, the gains in productivity when you do this right are so big that as the academic, I'm kind of scratching my head like, is this really real? But I've seen it happen enough times. We're talking 3- and 4-fold improvements in some cases, that I'm pretty confident that it actually is real in this context. And I think the reason is because the way that we do it now with the overload just burns way more resources than we think, because we've become so habituated to it.
It's a fairly big question, but when you look back at your career and your research, what are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned and you carry forward?
So I have 2, I think, at least, maybe 3. So I think the number one, and this is a speech I give to my PhD students all the time, which is, when a PhD student comes in, they're looking for a topic and they're reading the literature. And I think you have this, I had this too, you have this myth that, the senior faculty show up and they, write a brilliant paper in a couple hours and they go out to lunch, and, the PhD students feel kind of lost. And, and what I always tell them is, if you walk into any real organization and do your own go see and assess, if you can take the blinders off just a little bit and really think kind of carefully about how the work is actually done versus how we think it should be done, there is a lifetime of research topics. And I think, the corollary for that for people who are not going to research is, don't take the status quo for granted. A lot of the stuff that we do is kind of crazy and nutty, and we do it today because we did it yesterday. Organizations tend to be very inertial beasts. So I think number one is, and it's hard because, again, habituation is a very powerful psychological force, but don't be afraid to kind of question the dogma, because I think there is this implicit assumption that what is also what should be there. And I just don't think that that's necessarily true all the time. So that's be number one. I think number 2 for me, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, is in my work, it's always worked best just to get started, right? Again, I just kind of start focusing on those puzzle pieces and try to just count on the fact that if I keep working on it, somehow this whole thing is going to come together. And the analogy that I often give my team right now is, it's a little bit what I understand the process of being a stand-up comedian is, right? So you start out on Monday night at open mic night, you write a few jokes and you see which people laugh to, and then maybe you kind of work out your act and you move to Thursday or Friday. And then, only after 2 or 3 years do you do your HBO or Netflix special or whatever. And I think it just takes a lot of iteration for new ideas to really come together cleanly. And, and when you say the book is readable, that for me is the highest possible compliment I could get, because we spent a lot of time and energy trying to get those, get, Don and I fought with each other and went back and forth to try to get what I think were fairly complicated ideas, hopefully across in a fairly thing. And I think don't underestimate the work that takes. I think there's a lot of iteration that goes into it. And this was probably brought home for me most. I remember when I was a PhD student, my advisor here, who's still a colleague, John Sturman, I would give him drafts of my papers. He would just cover them with red ink. And it was the most demoralizing process. I was like, I am never going to make it here. My work is terrible. And then one day I was traveling with him and we were in, adjoining airplane seats, and he pulls out a paper he's working on, to work out on the flight, and covered his own paper with red ink. And I was like, oh, I see, right? This isn't that I suck. It's that, there's just there's a whole level of performance here that I don't think I fully appreciate it. And then I'd say the last thing for me is, I have gotten so much from my collaborations, particularly with Don. I'm a lifetime academic. Don's a lifetime, manager and leader in the real world. And I think for us, there have been so many gains from that relationship. And it doesn't mean we haven't had the occasional conflict, because we definitely fought at different moments during the book process. But I think that ability to have a little bit of humility that maybe your particular profession or position doesn't have everything, and collaborate, has just been enormously useful for me. And I say this all the time, in a perfect world, every class I teach would be joint with a skilled practitioner. Because I think for me, when theory and practice are sort of equally present in my classroom, I think that's really when the magic happens. Those would be the three off the top of my head.
Yeah. And you've been a very competitive cyclist as well. How's that shaped your practice?
So that's such a great question. I think there's two answers to that question, which is, in my first foray into this sport, when I was in my sort of teens and early 20s, I was a chronic overtrainer and, would always train more than I should, and, had very sort of spotty results as a consequence. So one way to interpret the regulate the flow and all the research that I have done about overload and our propensity to take on too much is that's really just about me. It's me search rather than research. So I think figuring out to regulate volume is something that's just been a sort of core theme in my life. And then I think the other thing is, for me, is, I think through sports, and I try to do this with my own children, is, they're just, you have bad days, right? And that's not, a definitive, referendum on your whole career. And you got to sometimes get through those troughs in order to get to the next level. And I think having had the confidence, or having had the experience of being through that once in sports, made it much easier in academia. And I remember when I first got to MIT, I was definitely behind my fellow graduate students, probably because I'd majored in bike racing in college rather than math and all the smart stuff that they'd done. But I do think competitive sports was really useful in kind of having the confidence to sort of stay the course even when you had bad days, because I think excuse the off-color language, had my ass handed to me several times in different contexts, and knew that was a survivable experience. And I think, had I not had that, I think getting through graduate school and early junior faculty would have been a lot more difficult, because stuff just doesn't go well, particularly if you're trying to do work that's sort of at the cutting edge of what's possible.
What do you do to keep learning and evolving in your field? Obviously, you've got your professorship and you get invited into lots of interesting research as well. But what particular practices or habits have you found particularly useful to sort of keep the saw sharp for you?
So the number one for me is to go to the field. And it's funny, every Sunday night when I've agreed to a trip and I'm packing and I got to go to the airport, I'm like, why did I do this? I don't have time. Travel's a pain in the ass. And I always come back and I'm like, I'm so happy I've gone, because I think for me, that contact with practitioners and with the real world and talking to people that have real problems has just been a sort of endless source of inspiration. And, one of the things that happened is that the early part of my career and the early version of the firefighting stuff was a lot in R&D organizations and Harley and some car companies and stuff like that. And a little bit later, I started working in the energy industry, which was a new venue for me. And the thing that was really different is they just had a hazard profile that was so much higher. Like, automobile assembly plants do not catch on fire and blow up very often. And that does happen much more in chemical and oil refining plants. And so that was, and what was so helpful about that is seeing the dynamics I had seen in one place in this new place, but in a very different organization, like really opened my eyes. Like, oh, this is actually a more universal set of things. And I don't think dynamic work design would exist if I hadn't sort of seen these same dynamics in a couple different venues. So for me, number one is definitely getting out of the office. No question.
And obviously, we recommend everybody goes and buys your book. But are there any other kind of resources that you've read or listened to recently that have inspired you and you'd recommend that our audience go and follow up?
It's interesting. A little bit under duress. I recently read the Elon Musk biography because people kept saying that Walter Isaacson book, like, you got to read this because Elon does some of the stuff you talk about. And I will say, like, I do not agree with many of the things that he does. He's a very complicated character. We could probably do a whole other podcast on that. But I do think it is fascinating to sort of think, to see how he works and his kind of laser focus on what's happening on the ground and his willing to get his hands dirty, I think is pretty impressive. So I think if you can read things like that with a critical eye and, not adopt it wholesale, but think carefully, I think all those tales from the field are very useful. The other thing that I really sort of go back to over and over again is I think in the last 10 or 15 years, the fact that psychologists have been writing more popular books, I think has been a huge bonus for the field. And Adam Grant and Jonathan Haidt and some of the other folks, I highly recommend all of those works. I think they're really helpful. And, the mapping from what happens in the research lab to what happens in the real world is a little bit complicated, but I think that stuff is really inspirational because I think if you go way back to the birth of the modern corporate form and sort of the early 20th century, we just had such an impoverished view of how human beings work. And, as we learn more about the wonderfully flawed human animal, I think it just enormously helpful in terms of figuring out how to design organizations that take advantage of the things we're good at and offset some of the things that we're not so good at.
Brilliant. And then last question from us. What advice would you give? They've listened to this, they've read the book, and they're looking to take their sort of first steps into dynamic work design. What advice would you give someone who's sort of considering sort of applying that in their organization?
Yeah. So I would say find a problem to go work on. I think, a really good choice is if you have a perennial issue that just happens over and over again, excuse slightly off-color language, is a big pain in your ass. That is a great place to start. We talk a little bit in the book about how to formulate clear problem statements, but it's pretty straightforward. You have a target, you have an actual, if you can see a gap between them, and then go see the work. In the final chapter, we talk about this story about Don going to the shipping dock. Find the equivalent of the shipping dock in your organization and go watch the problem happen. And if you do those two things, you're already 50% of the way, I think, to solving that problem. And then the rest of the book will give you some guidance about how to think about that. But usually those two things are enough to get the momentum rolling.
Well, Nelson, I want to say a huge thank you. This is our last recording of the year, and it's been we couldn't have finished in more style than this. So for us, it's been a really brilliant experience. But just sitting with your writing and your research has been a really wonderful experience. Danny, what are you taking away from today's conversation?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. I thought you've done a really lovely job of bringing the concepts to life and making them really accessible. So thank you for that. I think there's a lot of things that stick with me, but the idea of principles, so kind of isolating the principles and really kind of adapting them to your context rather than taking them wholesale. I like what you said about creeping incrementalization, so that idea of start small and prove it works and then grow out from there. And I love the discussion about huddles and handoffs and making sure we're identifying where we just need to have a conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I mean, this is a lot of fun, so thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Brilliant. Yeah. And I think the things that stood out for me, there's so much, but I'd love expediting is the enemy of efficiency. I think that's one of the things I'm taking away. Adrenaline isn't the only option for optimal working. One of the things I really like as well is that the fact that very senior leaders, it will feel like you're working below your pay grade initially, because start small, and that's what starts the momentum as well. It's been brilliant. If people want to follow your work, obviously we're highly recommending your book on and it's on audio as well. How can people follow your work and keep up to date?
Yeah, so please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. That's probably my main venue for new stuff. I'm always happy to connect with people. Also, Don and I have a little consulting company on the side called Shift Gear, which you can find at shiftgear.com, all one word. And that has, both connections to some of the work we do, but a lot of the resources, our YouTube channel and stuff like that. And then also I have an MIT faculty page, which if you just type my name into whatever your favorite browser, that will come up. But I think LinkedIn is probably the most immediate place to kind of connect with the ongoing flow of what we're up to. then I'd love to connect with people.
So if you are watching this and you're thinking you know someone that would really appreciate from Nelson's writing and research as well, then please do share this. We always say this, but we're so impressed with the number of shares that people have. So if you can see someone who's they're not waving, they're drowning. So then please do share this with it. And also, if you've really enjoyed it, we'd love it if you like it, because the more likes we get, the more subscriptions we get, the more ability we've got to invite brilliant guests like Nelson onto the podcast as well. But Nelson, above all, we just want to say a huge thank you. You're intensely busy. You've made time for us. You've answered all of our questions, and you've just been a joy to deal with as well.
My pleasure. Thank you both. It was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it. And thanks for your help in getting the word out there. So,
thank you.